The big golden cat sat at the end of the hallway, perfectly still, staring at the closed bedroom door as if he had never seen it before in his life. His thick, tawny fur rose slightly along his spine, not in anger, not in play, but in something that had no clean name. He had walked that same hallway 1,000 times. He knew the creak of the third floorboard, the particular way afternoon light fell across the rug near the window, and yet he stood there, frozen, his amber eyes fixed on the door as though something on the other side had become, without warning, completely unknown. What had changed inside that room, or what had changed inside him? Maple Hollow was the kind of neighborhood that time had agreed, quietly and without ceremony, to leave mostly alone. The oak trees along Ridgewood Lane were tall enough to make strangers look up. The mailboxes, each one painted by hand with small flowers or birds or the occasional lazy sun, had stood at the ends of their driveways for so many decades that they had stopped being objects and become landmarks. Elowen Pierce had lived there for 31 years, long enough to have painted her own mailbox twice, first with blue morning glories, and after her husband passed, with a quieter pattern of pale yellow leaves. It was not a statement. It was simply what felt right at the time. Her mornings had a particular shape, the kettle on the stove at 7:30, the soft creak of the back door opening onto the small garden where the rosemary had grown wild and the wooden bench had gone silver with weather. And always, always, the warmth of Barnaby weaving between her ankles as she moved from the kitchen to the sitting room, his tail raised high, his deep purr a kind of punctuation to the quiet hours. Barnaby was a Maine Coon, 5 years old, with a coat the color of autumn honey and a face that wore permanent dignity the way old professors wear reading glasses. He was not a dramatic animal. He did not knock things from shelves or yowl at 3 in the morning. He simply existed alongside Elowen with the calm reliability of a good clock. And she had come to love that about him more than she could have said to anyone without feeling a little embarrassed. It was a Tuesday in October when the cup fell. She had been standing at the kitchen counter, reaching for the tea canister with one hand and holding a full cup in the other, when she turned and saw him. Barnaby was near the back door, crouched low, his ears folded flat against his skull, the fur along his spine raised in a stiff ridge. His eyes. Those warm amber eyes she had looked into 10,000 times were fixed on her, and from deep inside his chest came a sound she had never once heard from him before. Low, sustained. A vibration that barely qualified as sound at all, and yet filled the entire kitchen. The cup hit the floor. The crack of porcelain on hardwood was sharp and final, like a door being shut on something. She did not move to pick up the pieces. She stood there, barefoot among the broken china and the spreading puddle of tea, staring at the animal she had lived with for 5 years, who was now looking at her as though she were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. Barnaby. His name came out soft, almost a question. The cat did not blink. He pressed himself lower toward the floor, the growl still humming in his chest, his eyes never leaving her face. Then, slowly, he backed toward the corner near the door and stayed there, watching. Elowen set down the tea canister. She stepped back 1 pace, then 2, giving him room, giving herself room. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the comfortable quiet she was used to in that house. This one had weight. She cleaned up the broken cup without a word. That night, she told herself it was stress. Perhaps a bird had flown too close to the window. Perhaps a noise from outside had startled him. Something she had not heard. Animals had bad days. That was allowed. But when she reached down to stroke his back before bed, the way she had done every single night since he was a kitten small enough to fit inside one of her garden boots, Barnaby pulled away, not frightened exactly, but deliberate. He moved to the far end of the bedroom, curled against the baseboard, and watched her from the dark. She lay in bed for a long time that night, listening to the house settle around her, and to the silence where his purring used to be. Something was wrong. She did not know yet how wrong, but the knowing was already beginning, the way cold weather begins long before the first frost appears on the glass. By the third day, Barnaby had disappeared into the house itself. Not gone, but invisible in the way that only cats and sorrow can be invisible. He was behind the sofa, inside the narrow corridor closet where Elowen kept the vacuum cleaner and extra blankets. Once, she found him beneath the kitchen sink, pressed into the very back corner behind the pipes, his eyes catching the light like two small coins in the dark. "There you are," she said, crouching down slowly, her knees protesting the way knees do after 60 years of use. He looked at her, and looked through her, at the same time. That was the part she could not explain to herself. It was not simply fear, the way a nervous cat fears a loud noise or an unfamiliar visitor. This was something more layered, more interior, as though he were standing behind a window, pressing his paws against the glass, and she was standing on the other side doing the same, and neither one of them could find the door. She began to keep a small notebook on the kitchen table. She had always been a woman who wrote things down, grocery lists, garden notes, the occasional letter she never sent. Now, she wrote what she observed. Tuesday, refused breakfast until noon, ate quickly, looking over his shoulder, would not come to the sitting room. Wednesday, found behind the sofa at 7 in the morning. Growled when I approached, stopped growling after I sat on the floor 3 feet away and read aloud for 20 minutes. That last detail surprised her when she wrote it. She had not planned to read aloud. She had simply picked up the novel from the side table, settled cross-legged on the floor, and started reading because the silence felt unbearable and her voice was the only thing she had to offer. And somewhere around the 3rd page of the chapter, the growling had stopped. He had not come closer, but he had stopped. She wrote that down twice, underlining it. Her neighbor, Constance Whitfield, came by on Wednesday afternoon with a container of lentil soup and a look of barely concealed concern. Constance was 72, sharp as a letter opener, and had been bringing soup to people during difficult times for so long that the gesture had become almost ceremonial. "He's hiding," she said, setting the soup on the counter and peering into the sitting room as though Barnaby might present himself for inspection. "Behind the sofa, mostly," Elowen said. "Or in the closet. He won't eat normally. He won't let me near him." Constance was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone searching their memory for something useful. "My daughter's dog," she said finally, "a few years back, started acting strange, anxious, confused, hiding. Turned out to be something neurological." She paused. "She took him to a specialist clinic in Portland, Dr. Marrick's place. They sorted it out." Elowen looked up from her tea. "A neurologist, for animals." "For animals," Constance confirmed, without a trace of irony, "because their brains are as complicated as ours, and sometimes just as stubborn." After her neighbor left, Elowen sat at the kitchen table for a long time, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, listening to the distant sound of Barnaby moving somewhere in the walls of the house. Not in the walls, literally of course, but that is what it felt like. Close enough to hear, far enough to be unreachable. She pulled the notebook toward her and wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. "Portland, Neurological Clinic. Call tomorrow." Then she closed it and went to sit on the floor near the sofa and read aloud until it was time for bed. The growling did not come that night. What came instead, just before she turned off the lamp, was the faint, uncertain sound of Barnaby shifting closer in the dark. Not close enough to touch, but closer than he had been. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply stayed. And somehow, that felt like the most important thing she had done all day. Getting Barnaby into a carrier had always been, in the loosest possible sense, a negotiation. In his younger days, the sight of the blue plastic crate would cause him to adopt an expression of profound personal insult. Ears slightly back, tail lowered, the general demeanor of a dignitary who has just been informed his reservation has been lost. But he had always gone in, eventually, with enough patience and the strategic placement of a small piece of smoked salmon near the back of the crate. This time was different. The first attempt happened on a Thursday morning. Elowen brought the carrier out from the hall closet, set it on the kitchen floor with the door open, and placed a treat just inside the opening, the way she always had. Barnaby was in the sitting room, on the far end of the sofa. He saw the crate. His body went rigid. The growl started before she even took a step toward him, deep and immediate, like a warning signal that had been waiting all morning to be triggered. She backed away. She sat down. She waited. He did not move from the sofa for 2 hours. The second attempt was Friday afternoon. She tried a different approach, covering the crate with a familiar blanket that carried her scent, leaving it in the corner of the sitting room for most of the day, so it would simply become part of the landscape. When she finally approached him gently, towel in hand, speaking in the low, unhurried voice she used for difficult things, Barnaby bolted. He was behind the armchair in an instant, pressed flat, breathing fast, his eyes enormous. She sat on the floor beside the armchair for 40 minutes. He did not come out. The third attempt was Saturday morning, and by then Elowen had stopped trying to be strategic. She was tired in a way that went beyond sleep, the kind of tired that comes from watching someone you love struggle and being unable to explain to them, in any language they can currently understand, that you are trying to help. She sat down on the sitting room floor with her back against the sofa, her legs stretched out in front of her, and she did not look at him. She did not reach for him. She did not speak for a while. Then she began to talk, not about the carrier, not about the vet or the clinic or any of it. She talked about the morning she had brought him home as a kitten, how he had sat in the pocket of her cardigan for most of the drive because the carrier had seemed too large and too cold, and she had taken pity on him. She talked about the winter 2 years ago when the heating had failed and they had both slept under every blanket in the house, his warmth against her feet more effective than any radiator. She talked about small things, the way he always positioned himself between her and the television when he felt she had been watching it for too long, the particular chirping sound he made at birds through the window. The afternoon he had sat on her unfinished crossword for 45 minutes, apparently convinced it was urgent. She was not sure why she was saying any of it, but somewhere in the middle of a story about the time he had knocked a pot of basil off the windowsill and then looked at her with the calm certainty that gravity was entirely to blame. She heard movement, slow, careful, the soft press of paws on hardwood. She did not look up. Barnaby moved around the edge of the sofa, stopped, moved again. She could feel him close now, that particular warmth that a living creature carries with it, even when it does not want to be seen. And then, very slowly, he lowered himself to the floor beside her, not touching, but there. She kept talking, her voice low and even, as though this were entirely ordinary. 5 minutes later, she reached for the carrier with one hand, never raising her voice, never pausing in the story. And Barnaby, with one long, uncertain look at the crate and then at her face, walked inside. She fastened the door with hands that were not entirely steady. "Good boy," she said, barely above a whisper. "Good, good boy." The drive to Portland took just under 2 hours. The road wound through countryside that had gone fully into autumn, copper and red, and the deep burnt orange of leaves that had decided to be extraordinary on their way out. Elowen kept one hand on the carrier the entire drive, her fingers laced through the grate, and Barnaby pressed his nose against her fingertips once, just once, and then looked out at the road ahead as though he were navigating. She almost laughed. Almost. The clinic smelled of clean linen and something faintly herbal, not unpleasant, but precise. The kind of smell that meant people here paid close attention. A young technician with a calm manner and a very sensible ponytail took down every detail Elowen could give. Dates, behaviors, the notebook entries she had thought to bring along. The notes were read carefully, without any of the subtle dismissiveness she had half expected. A neurological examination was recommended. Then came the waiting. Elowen sat in a chair near the window and watched the parking lot and the thin strip of October sky above the roofline and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of difficult. Around her, other people sat with their animals in carriers or on leashes. A man in his 80s, with a small terrier asleep across his shoes. A younger woman with a rabbit in a box, stroking the top of it absently. Everyone carrying their private worry with the patient, slightly formal dignity that waiting rooms seem to require. The neurologist was a measured man with careful eyes and the kind of voice that had clearly delivered difficult news many times without ever making it feel routine. He sat across from her and folded his hands. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, "I want to walk you through what we found." She had prepared herself in the way that people prepare themselves for things they cannot actually prepare for, by telling herself firmly and repeatedly that whatever it was, she would manage. She had managed before. The neurologist explained it slowly, which she was grateful for. A small mass, a tumor, though he was careful with that word, using it clinically rather than dramatically, had formed in a region of Barnaby's brain that governed perception and behavioral response. Not large, not fast-moving based on what they could assess, but positioned in precisely the way that would cause the most disorienting effect. What it means practically, he said, is that familiar stimuli are being misread. His own home, his own smells, the people he knows, are registering as unfamiliar, potentially as threatening. Elowen sat very still. "He is not afraid of you," the doctor continued, his voice careful and even. "He does not recognize you, consistently. There is a difference." She absorbed this slowly, the way cold water absorbs into dry earth, not all at once, but steadily, changing the composition of things as it goes. "The moments when he seemed almost like himself," she said, "are likely moments when the signal breaks through correctly," he said. "The pathways are still there. They are simply interrupted." She thought of Barnaby pressing his nose against her fingers through the carrier grate on the drive down. That single brief moment of contact, whether he had known her in that instant or whether it had been some older, deeper reflex, she could not say. But it had felt, for just a second, like recognition. "What are the options?" she asked. There was one realistic path forward: surgery, microsurgical removal of the mass, performed by a specialist the clinic worked with regularly. The risk was genuine. The location of the tumor made the procedure delicate. There were no guarantees of full recovery, and the possibility of complications was not small. But without intervention, the progression was likely to continue. She did not ask how long. She had decided, somewhere between the waiting room and this chair, that she was not going to ask how long. It was not a question she wanted the answer to. Not yet. "If the surgery goes well," she said instead, "what does recovery look like?" The neurologist leaned forward slightly. "Gradual. There will likely be some continued confusion in the early weeks. But the behavioral changes you've described, the fear response, the failure to recognize, those are the most reversible effects if the mass is successfully removed." She nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "Then we do the surgery," she said. There was no drama in her voice when she said it, no trembling declaration. She simply said it the way she said most things that mattered, plainly, with the full weight of having thought it through. The paperwork was completed. The date was set for 4 days later. She was given careful instructions for keeping him calm in the interim, feeding schedules, what to watch for, a number to call at any hour if she was concerned. On the drive home, the carrier sat on the back seat, and Barnaby was quieter than he had been on the way there. Whether that was exhaustion or the residue of the examination, she could not tell. The autumn landscape scrolled past the windows in the fading afternoon light, and Elowen drove with both hands on the wheel and her mind on a particular image she kept returning to. Barnaby, as a very young cat, sitting in the pocket of her green cardigan, peering out at the world with enormous, uncomplicated eyes. He had trusted her completely then. He still was, even now, in his confusion. In the only way his broken circuitry would allow. She understood that now. When they arrived home, she carried the carrier inside and opened the door without ceremony, and Barnaby walked out slowly, looked around the familiar hallway as though assessing it for the first time, and disappeared behind the sofa. She did not follow him. She put the kettle on, sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, and wrote at the top of a new page, in her careful, even handwriting, "He is still in there. He is trying." Then she closed the notebook, poured her tea, and went to sit on the floor near the sofa, and she read aloud until it was dark. The house was not empty in any literal sense during those 4 days. Elowen was in it, the furniture was in it, the smell of rosemary from the garden drifted through the back door on the mild afternoons, and the oak tree in the yard made its usual low sound in the evening wind. All of that was present, but the quality of the silence had changed. Barnaby moved through the house like a shadow that had learned to be careful, present, visible in glimpses, but always just at the edge of contact. He ate slowly, watchfully, the way animals eat when they are not entirely sure the meal is safe. He slept in places he had never used before, the corner behind the armchair, the narrow space between the bookcase and the wall, as though the places he had always chosen felt to him foreign now. She gave him space. She also, against the advice of nothing in particular, began leaving small traces of herself around the house. The cardigan she wore most often draped over the arm of his usual chair, a worn scarf on the floor near his food bowl. Nothing calculated, just the presence of familiar things in accessible places, as though she were laying down a trail of small, soft breadcrumbs. On the second evening, she noticed him sleeping with his chin resting on the edge of the cardigan. She wrote that down. Constance came by again on the third day, this time with shortbread and a kind of practical sympathy that involved very little sentiment and a great deal of sitting quietly at the kitchen table, drinking tea. They talked about other things for most of the visit. The neighbor, 2 streets over, who had begun an inexplicable project involving a very large amount of timber and apparent secrecy. The book group that had descended into open disagreement over a novel none of them had particularly enjoyed. The price of heating oil and the reliable injustice of October. It helped. The ordinary conversation, the warmth of another person in the kitchen, the sound of cups being set down on the table. It helped in the way that only very specific things help when you are waiting for something large and uncertain. "You're doing everything right, you know," Constance said near the end of the visit, looking at the cardigan on the chair and the notebook on the table with the quiet perceptiveness of someone who notices things but rarely announces it. Elowen looked up. "I don't know that I'm doing anything." "That's exactly what I mean," her neighbor said. After Constance left, Elowen stood at the kitchen window for a while, watching the garden go gold in the late afternoon. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had buried a husband. She had navigated the particular loneliness of a house that used to hold more people and learned, slowly and without grace, to furnish it differently on the inside. She had done hard things. But this, the waiting, the not knowing, the sight of Barnaby looking at her with eyes that held her and lost her at the same time. This had its own specific weight. On the morning of the surgery, she drove him to the clinic in the early grey light before the town was properly awake. The streets were quiet. The trees along the road held their colour in the pale morning like something deliberate, like they had decided to be beautiful on a day that needed it. She carried the carrier inside and handed it to the technician with the sensible ponytail, who received it with the careful, unhurried manner that Elowen had come to find genuinely steadying. "He's going to be looked after very well," the young woman said, not as a platitude, but as a fact. Elowen nodded. She looked at Barnaby through the grate of the carrier. He looked back, that amber gaze, steady, unreadable, carrying whatever version of the world he was currently living in. "I'll be here," she said to him quietly. "When you come out, I'll be right here." She did not know if he understood. She said it anyway. The drive home took the same amount of time as always, but felt much longer. She made tea she did not drink. She tidied rooms that were already tidy. She sat in the garden for a while with her hands in her lap and the smell of rosemary around her and the October sky, very blue and very still above the yard. And she let herself feel, without apology, how much that animal mattered to her. Some people would have found it difficult to explain. The depth of it, the specific grief of a house without him in it, even temporarily. But Elowen had stopped apologizing for the things she loved a long time ago. That was one advantage of having lived long enough. She went inside, made fresh tea, sat at the table, and opened her notebook to a clean page. She did not write anything for a long while. Then, finally, she wrote one line: "Come back." The call came on the second morning after the surgery. She had been awake since before 5, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the particular alertness of someone who has been sleeping lightly for days. When her phone lit up on the table, she picked it up before the second ring. The surgery had been completed successfully. There had been no significant complications. Barnaby was in recovery, stable, resting, being monitored carefully. She could come in that afternoon. She sat very still for a moment after she put the phone down. Then she pressed her hand flat against the notebook on the table and breathed. The clinic in the afternoon had a different atmosphere than it had during the examination days, quieter, more interior, the low hum of machines and the careful footsteps of staff moving between rooms. The technician with the sensible ponytail led her to a small recovery room with good light and the smell of clean fabric and something faintly medicinal that was not unpleasant. Barnaby was on a low, padded surface, lying on his side. He looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps just more still. There were the signs of the procedure, a small area of shaved fur, a careful dressing, the thin line of a monitoring lead. His eyes were half closed, the heavy liquid rest of deep sedation wearing off into something lighter. Elowen pulled a chair close and sat. She did not reach for him immediately. She had learned, over these weeks, the particular value of simply being present without demand, of offering herself as a constant rather than an event. So she sat, and she kept her hands in her lap, and she let the room be quiet. Then, after a moment, she spoke. "Hey," she said. The word came out low and unhurried, barely above a breath. "It's me." The room held its stillness. And then, very slowly, Barnaby's eyes opened a little further. He did not move. He did not lift his head, but his gaze found her, traveled to her face, and stayed there. And in those amber eyes, still clouded at the edges with the residue of anesthesia and days of confusion, something was different. They were soft, not the wide, alarmed eyes of the past weeks, not the eyes of an animal looking at a stranger through a fog of misread signals. These were quieter, more themselves. She could not have explained the difference in technical terms, but she knew it, the way you know a voice on the phone without being told the name. He knew her. Not fully. Not yet. But the knowing was there, beginning to reassemble itself, like morning light coming in under a door. "There you are," she said very softly. "There you are." She stayed for 2 hours that first visit. She talked a little, the same low, even voice, the familiar stories, the unimportant details of ordinary days that had turned out over these weeks to be the most important currency she had. The rosemary was still growing wild in the garden. Constance had brought shortbread twice. The book group had apparently made peace temporarily over a murder mystery everyone agreed was at least competent. Barnaby listened, or rested inside the sound of her voice. She was not entirely sure there was a difference. He came home 5 days later. The recovery was slow, and it was real. Not the clean, decisive recovery of stories where the resolution arrives all at once, but the kind that happens in increments almost too small to measure. There were still mornings when he seemed uncertain of things, when he sat in the middle of a room and looked around as though recalibrating. There were days when he ate a little less and moved a little more carefully and seemed to need the reassurance of proximity without contact. Just being in the same room, just knowing she was there. She gave him all of that. 3 weeks after the surgery, on a morning when the first real cold of the season had arrived overnight and the kitchen windows had gone misty with the warmth inside versus the chill outside. Elowen was sitting on the sofa with her tea and the novel she'd been reading on and off since August. The pale winter light came through the curtains in that particular way it has in late autumn. Not warm exactly, but honest. The house smelled of tea and old wood and the faint greenness of the rosemary she had cut and left in a jar on the windowsill. She heard the soft sound of paws on the floor. She did not look up. The cushion beside her dipped slightly, and then the familiar weight, that specific, unmistakable warmth, settled against her leg. Barnaby arranged himself with the unhurried certainty of an animal returning to a place that had always belonged to him. He tucked his paws beneath his chest, let out one long, slow breath, and began, quietly, to purr. She set down her book. She looked at him for a long moment, at the golden fur catching the pale morning light, at the slow rise and fall of his breathing, at the eyes that were closed now in the complete and undefended ease of an animal that feels entirely safe. She placed her hand, very gently, on his back. He did not move away. The purr deepened. She did not cry exactly. What came was quieter than that, a loosening of something she had been holding tightly for weeks without fully realizing the effort it had cost her. It moved through her chest and settled, and left behind something that felt very much like relief, and very much like gratitude, and very much like the specific, irreplaceable warmth of being found. Outside, the oak tree made its low sound in the November wind. Somewhere on Ridgewood Lane, a door opened and closed. The kettle on the stove ticked as it cooled. And in the quiet sitting room of a house in Maple Hollow, a woman and her cat simply stayed. That was enough. That was everything. There are moments in a life when love does not look like anything grand or spoken. Sometimes it looks like sitting on a floor, talking to someone who cannot answer because the alternative is silence, and silence is not something love can accept. Barnaby had not changed. He'd been lost inside a confusion not of his making, pressing against the glass of himself, trying to find the way back to the one person who had never, not for a single day, stopped waiting for him. And Elowen had learned something in those weeks. Something she would carry long after the notebook was full and the teacup had been replaced and the mornings had settled back into their familiar shape. She had learned that love, real love, does not require understanding. It does not require explanation or guarantee or the certainty that things will be returned in the form you offered them. It only requires presence, the willingness to stay, to speak into the silence, to sit on the floor and tell the same stories again, not because they will be understood, but because the voice itself is a kind of home. And sometimes that is enough to bring someone back.